Brisbane to a Food System Horizons webinar, and good afternoon for those from the day on daylight savings and other parts of the world. And also, it's still early in WA, so anyone from WA, good morning. Welcome to another Food Systems Horizons webinar. We're here to actually talk about a part of the food system that's really central to it, agriculture and farming systems. And we're really pleased to do that, sort of cheekily in line with National Agriculture Day, which is happening tomorrow, not today, it's tomorrow, that the NFF are actually hosting. So thought it'd be really timely to celebrate this part of our food system and get to understand how we navigate the future moving forward, given how farming systems have been navigating so much change already through the centuries, really. I'd love to flag and just begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands from which we meet. Here in Brisbane, Meanjin, we are with the Yagara and Turrbal peoples, and like to acknowledge the elders past, present, and emerging. If you'd like to put in your chats, the lands in which you are from, please do, and welcome. I'm going to start off with a brief introduction to Frank and Katie, who are going to be our speakers for today. Now, Frank has a long connection with Food System Horizons, and he is actually, as the previous director of FSH, but he's a principal research scientist, senior principal research scientist at CSIRO Agriculture and Food, and he has been a co-author of, if you would remember, the Food Systems Roadmap that was launched in 2023, Reshaping Australian Food Systems. Catherine Wynne is also here, is also a co-author of that. And that has been really like a huge part of the work that we do here at Food System Horizons. So it's really sort of paved the way of how we frame food systems and the way we view systems in general. From then, Frank has actually, he's had massive experience in all sorts of different spaces around food systems, climate, sustainable land management. I have to read this because it's long. Biodiversity, carbon finance, and he's also now IPCC lead author. Now he's working on farming systems and applying that global experience to the sustainability challenges in Australian agriculture. We also have Katie McRobert, who's one of my favourite people and one long-standing supporter of Food System Horizons. Katie is Executive Director of the Australian Farm Institute, where she leads evidence-based policy research on agri-food system sustainability. I hold Katie dear to my heart because I know she has a strong background in comms as well and doesn't actually talk about that too openly, but that is monumental in terms of, it's a skill that's really important in cutting through complex spaces like this, really. And that's a really important part where you've got, different stakeholders with different perspectives. Katie holds an MBA in Sustainable Business from Griffith University and serves in several advisory groups, including CSIRO's Agriculture and Food Research Unit. Her work reflects deep commitment to supporting sustainable agriculture through informed policy and collaboration. And she's going to talk about a little bit of that perspective in this session. So with no further ado, I'm going to pass on to Frank. We'll do a presentation first and then on to Katie, and then we'll have questions after. And remember, feel free to put your questions in the chat if you have them, something burning, and I'll try and go through them. But if not, know that at the end of the presentations, we'll have a discussion. We can all have a chat. All right, over to you, Frank.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Lily. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to present today's Food System Horizons webinar from Meanjin, Brisbane. I hope you can all see the slides well. So before doing so, I would also like to acknowledge the Turrbal, Yagara, and Yugara people, the traditional owners of the land from which I'm presenting from today, as well as the First Nations peoples from all the lands we are gathering from today. I acknowledge and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples joining us here today. So, what should a thriving agriculture look like by mid-century, and how would we get there? I'm delighted to share with you some insights and perspectives on behalf of the Ag2050 team, which I hope you will find useful in exploring these questions. Let's start with some advanced considerations, though. While often taken for granted, agriculture is really the bedrock for societal activities. As highlighted in the recent Food System Horizons report, approximately 100,000 Australian farmers are producing for a food system that delivers caloric supply for 100 million people. Australian agriculture production stretches across climatic zones from temperate to tropical. Despite much of Australia's farming activities facing some of the greatest climate and environmental variability in the world and having to navigate fluctuating market conditions, total productivity, while variable, is generally increasing. Over the recent years, the gross value of agriculture production has been approaching and straddling 100 billion Australian dollars, clearly placing the 2030 target within reach. But the focus on productivity or economic performance alone is surely not enough to define a thriving agriculture. The recent years and decades have also shown a proliferation of demands that the agriculture sector is confronted with, while farmers having to navigate an increasing complex and changing risk landscape. Applying a systems perspective to farming is important to combine an emphasis on improving productivity, generating livelihood and economic opportunities, while also reducing environmental harm and addressing emerging risks and adapting to changes. Agriculture production, as Lily already hinted at, is a system within systems. Depending on the natural system for environmental goods and services, as well as impacting on it, and embedded in the wider agri-food system with links to other human systems, be it health, energy, transport, and so on. So if we connect this back to the schematic of Food System Horizons with agriculture production as a part of the food system, we need to be really conscious of the linkages and feedback loops across scales, as these can have ripple effects through the supply chain and for Australia's agriculture. So what futures can and should we prepare for, and how should this inform actions now? With these considerations in mind now, let me introduce the approach taken by the Ag2050 Initiative. Why is it important to consider multiple futures? So often when we predict a future outcome like rainfall or crop yields, we are working within a relatively narrow band of possibilities tied to past conditions. In light of the complexity of changes, this may offer a false sense of precision. Particularly as we move further into the future, it is valuable to try to capture the spectrum of uncertainty surrounding the outlook of agriculture. In this context, foresighting takes a broader view. It helps us stretch our thinking. Instead of asking what's most likely, we ask what else could plausibly happen. So the Ag2050 initiative is designed to help us imagine what farming systems could look like in 2050, as the name obviously implies. It's about equipping ourselves to make better choices in the face of uncertainty. The initiative is structured along a scoping, exploration, and testing phase. Aim is to guide potential system designs and desirable pathways for Australian agriculture. The ongoing work of Ag2050 is underpinned by 4 scenario narratives. These are regional ag capitals, landscape stewardship, climate survival, and system decline. A short summary of the process on how we arrived at this. The scenarios were developed through an extensive consultation process of internal and external stakeholders. Discussions considered the future outcome of a range of drivers that are relevant to the farming systems, which are just listed here in the table and which you can dive into deeper in the Ag2050 scenarios report. These drivers were then used to inform, debate, and co-create multiple scenarios, so the different outcomes of these drivers that they could take, and then which were ultimately distilled then into 4 illustrative scenario narratives presented here. These 4 scenarios provide then the foundation for discussing the contexts and enabling environment that increase the likelihood of collectively building a desirable future and also how to possibly avoid undesirable outcomes and minimize trade-offs. In this, as also the figure to the left shows, regional ag capitals and landscape stewardship describe plausible futures where Australian agriculture could be thriving. They share an emphasis on innovation and systems thinking, which leads to transformative outcomes. But their focus is different. Regional ag capitals focuses on consolidation, so the bundling and concentration of industries, facilitating specialization and scale up, while landscape stewardship, by contrast, emphasizes diversification of income streams and through decentralized innovation models. By contrast, climate survival and system decline describe stagnant and regressive futures respectively. Alongside sustainability concerns, resilience of agriculture production is a pervasive issue. It is not only about bouncing back after a shock, but it is also about bouncing forward, being prepared for change to come. So we use then the scenarios for defining research activities with the emerging perspectives being summarized in a special issue of the Farm Policy Journal in collaboration with the Australian Farm Institute, which includes contributions from 48 authors, which are listed here, representing AFI and various research programs across CSIRO. I will now try to summarize the range of topics covered to give you a flavor, which I hope then will entice you to dive deeper into the special issue and offer also a good starting point for the discussions with Katie on the enabling implications for the enabling environment. With this special issue, we would like to also commemorate our wonderful colleague and friend Torres Webb. In the article that Torres led in collaboration with colleagues, he reminded us about the importance of caring for country. Agriculture is a lot about identity. The engagement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in agriculture is about connection, dignity, and identity. At a time when agriculture faces a range of systemic challenges, the holistic thinking, the emphasis of circularity and connectivity of First Nations people can offer important insights and learning that should be reflected in exploring future scenarios and land management strategies. Land and water, after all, are the critical, essential resources for agriculture. How they are managed will greatly influence the sector's future prospects with regards to prosperity, resilience, and sustainability. Agriculture currently dominates land use, approximately constituting around 55% of the total land. But its share of the land has been declining by 23% from 1961 to 2022. Meanwhile, agriculture output has increased by 292%. In their discussion of agricultural land use, Kate Denton and colleagues from AFI expect a continuing trend towards less land for agriculture production towards mid-century, coupled with growing pressures from other land uses. They highlight possible options for managing these competing land uses and identifying synergistic solutions. Ashlyn Lee and colleagues then discuss and highlight that agriculture accounts for 74% of Australia's water consumption. Irrigated agriculture contributes about 1/3 to the sector's value, but represents only 7.2% of the cropped area. There are complex interactions of local and global drivers, including climate change, digital advances, changing consumer demands, and stewardship requirements. Both the land and water paper highlight the importance and challenge of building integrative systems-focused solutions that seek to manage and reconcile multiple objectives and interests, and that will become more important in the future as we move along. Australia's agriculture, as you're all aware, is inherently export-focused. Over 70% of Australia's produce is destined for export. This international role in food and nutritional security underscores the success story of Australia's production in a diverse and often highly variable environment, as also noted earlier. Yet many of the conditions that shape the evolution of Australia's export-focused agriculture system are changing. In the article with my colleague Nina Welti, we discussed the shifting global contexts, so changes that are beyond our full control but do impact on Australia. There's, for one, the international recognition of the pivotal role that agriculture has to play in sustainability transitions. This is reflected in the interlinked nature of the Sustainable Development Goals. It is recognized in the Paris Agreement on climate change with its objective of limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, the Global Biodiversity Framework of the CBD, and the UNCCD's Land Degradation Neutrality Target. In these and other international policy contexts, agriculture activities are recognized as both a cause to pressing sustainability challenges, as well as holding the key to their solutions. Enabling sustainability transitions, though, has implications for market access. Keywords are changing standards, sustainability credentials, traceability of supply chains. By contrast, falling short of these aspirations globally will have implications for Australia in terms of the risks that come with a warmer climate or a biologically depleted world. For example, recent scientific assessments of the collective national ambitions prior to mitigate climate change prior to the current climate conference taking place in Brazil, COP30, suggests that we are currently on a path to 2.6 degrees above pre-industrial levels, with all the risks that this entails. We are also witness to the already changing risk landscape and the exposure to diverse shocks of different origins that can compound each other's. And the origins are biophysical, economic, and social. This is evident, that was evident by the COVID-19 pandemic, the proliferation of conflicts, widespread climate extremes, including the recent cyclone and major flooding and drought events here in Australia. Some of these events appear already distant in memory, and I was reflecting on this because several of them are actually fairly recent, and I feel it is illustrating the pace of events and changes that we are confronted with. The current geopolitical crisis further underlines the need to embrace uncertainty, considering multiple more or less desirable contexts and how to best prepare for them. In this, adaptation to climate change is critical in shaping more desirable scenario narratives. With my colleagues Don Gaden and Lindsay Bell, I am discussing adaptation to climate change as an integral part to a broader risk management strategy for Australian agriculture. We argue that adaptation should be approached as a continuous and iterative process that has multiple tracks. Particularly for managing immediate and near-term production risks, incremental adaptation measures can help reduce farm-level vulnerabilities. Research by CSIRO colleagues and others has shown that the strategic combination of incremental measures can lead to transformative outcomes. While it is essential to continue to improve the adaptive capacity of existing practices and farming systems, we believe this should be done while planting also the seeds for transformative efforts, so that the capacities and infrastructure and enabling conditions are in place and we are prepared for larger scale changes before they materialize and avoid lock-in of maladaptive structures. Decision support tools are available that can help guide near-term action as well as informing strategic medium to long-term decisions. And we highlight some examples in our paper. My colleagues Rebecca Derbyshire and Dave Henry further then discuss the needs and gaps for improved agriculture-tailored climate risk information across scales. In connection to resilience considerations, Roger Laws and Chris Herman review the role of diversification from the field, farm, regional to national scale, and they consider various constraining factors. At the field scale, they highlight the opportunities that advances in technologies and practices can offer. Examples include multi-purpose crops and intercropping, as well as combinations with non-agriculture uses, such as agrivoltaics, that allow for diversification of farm enterprises. Despite a broad range of enterprises, a small number of industries dominate at national scale in terms of economic value. Particularly with regards to realizing favorable scenario narratives, the authors highlight the importance of balancing short-term commodity gains alongside long-term resilience considerations. So in the dynamic environment we are in, diversification should be seen as an insurance for enabling the evolution of the agricultural sector. Preparing and equipping the agricultural labor force with tools to manage changes will be critical in this process. In this context, Katie Ricketts and Sarah Whitnell specifically zoom in on potential effects of climate change and heat stress, which threatens worker health. Applying a uniform 2-degree temperature increase and comparing this to present-day conditions, they find declining labor productivity due to heat associated with increased operating costs, particularly for the horticultural farms. Adaptation options include increasing automation, modification of tasks and performance standards, cooling structures and gear, heat acclimatization programs, while the Ag2050 scenario narratives offer different potential for implementing strategic solutions. Digital technology and the emergence of AI can potentially help to alleviate some of the pressures on agriculture and its labor force. Sarah Hartman and team discuss some of the opportunities that include problem identification, optimization of solutions, improved monitoring and management, integration of diverse data sources, be it from sensors, drones, and satellites, decision support, for example, through improved weather and climate forecasting and agronomy. But there are also issues and risk, as you all trying out AI have experienced. Factual hallucinations are an issue in generative AI. Data security, privacy, and governance are a concern. There's a need to establish trust within and across systems. It is important that AI works for farmers and not the other way around, ensuring vibrant communities in this major transformative process. Australia has here an opportunity in playing a leading role in responsible AI. The authors imagine what this could look like under the different scenarios. These considerations are closely coupled with discussions around sovereign AI, particularly under consideration of the diverse geopolitical outlooks that we are currently facing. The authors highlight the importance of guardrails for responsible AI. Examples are fair data and care principles. Emphasis should be placed on trusted systems and human-centered design. Presently, CSIRO's Data 61, in collaboration with AFI, with Agriculture and Food, is working on co-designing solutions with agricultural stakeholders, including researchers, growers, and agtech. The aim is to integrate bottom-up approaches into the AI ecosystem, which are centered around the user needs and capabilities. Considering the combined challenges of climate change, shifting consumption patterns, and natural resources, alongside emerging technological opportunities, Sabrina Greenwood and colleagues explore possible outlooks for livestock production in Australia. Extending the Ag2050 scenario narrative specifically to livestock, some specific highlights include, and I focus here just on the two thriving scenarios potentially, regional ag capitals. Here the focus is on intensification and decoupling from environmental factors. So there's a shift towards indoor production systems where automation and technology are important factors. There are opportunities then for co-location with other industries. But there are important issues to consider: transition management, the public perception and social license, as well as possibly a lower genetic diversity of livestock. The landscape stewardship scenario places emphasis on productive and healthy landscapes. It focuses on a more integrated approach to livestock management informed by One Health perspectives. Issues to consider here are possibly reduced carrying capacities, which may be somewhat offset by benefits from natural capital markets. So strengthening the integration of production systems and pursuing multi-purpose solutions can also open up new opportunities. Here, for example, we we consider rethinking the approach to aquaculture. Currently, 65% of seafood consumed in Australia is imported. Mauricio Emeranziano and co-authors dive into possible outlooks for the aquaculture sector by mid-century. They highlight that evolving traceability and supply chain frameworks can open up new revenue streams, but also note critical challenges in overcoming labor shortages in the sector. Both regional ag capitals and landscape stewardship offer options for greater integration with agriculture, strengthening sustainability and circularity. Opportunities include reducing dependency on feed imports by harnessing locally produced plant protein and animal byproducts, so pushing along this integration, and exploring novel sources such as insect and microbial proteins. With the need to better manage natural capital, Maya Asek and team bring the prospects of the bioeconomy into focus. Under consideration of the Ag2050 scenarios, they highlight that the bioeconomy encapsulates economies that are focused on biological materials and services. It includes the production, utilization, and regeneration of biological resources and the relevant enabling environment. It will be of increasing importance due to societal demands for sustainability and net zero transitions, and I encourage you to dive into the article where the team further illustrates how the different scenarios could enable or constrain the growth of a bioeconomy. This brings me to the consideration about the approach to innovation at large. Anton Wasson and colleagues discuss how an innovation could be unlocked. Farming systems have been optimized for past conditions and specific contexts, as they note. This resulted in interdependencies between technologies and practice and created constraints. It is the interactions between genetics, environment, and management that shape farm productivity. Emerging technologies allow for greater integration and hence acceleration of innovation, moving beyond previous system boundaries. Commodity-focused innovation systems are important drivers of specialized advances. They are part of the success story of Australian agriculture. But there are limits for integrated and systemic solutions that some of the transformative adaptation pressures will require. How innovation is perceived and pursued will determine future pathways. Rose Roche and team considered different outlooks of what Australia's ag innovation systems could look like. The regional ag capital scenario presents a technology-driven, corporate-led innovation narrative and culture with possible strong emphasis on proprietary applications. Questions to consider here include transition management, how to ensure rural prosperity and vibrancy outside regional ag capital zones. The potential for lock-in risks. Is this approach too narrow for diverse and dynamic changes? By contrast, landscape stewardship highlights a narrative that emphasizes resilience and public good outcomes driven by incentive shifts and decentralized cross-sectoral innovation. The issue here is balancing diversity and scale. That will be the main challenge under this narrative. Climate survival and system decline really represent innovation systems that are not up to the task, that are too narrow or fragmented in focus, leading to suboptimal or regressive outcomes respectively. So at the end, as we are facing these dynamic challenges and uncertainty, it's about shaping the future together. It's about strengthening the innovation system for agriculture, and it requires a different approach to stakeholder engagement. Norton and co-authors highlight opportunities by combining tools from design thinking, personas, and living labs that can help make alternative scenarios more tangible and form action in conjunction with longer-term strategic planning. In an increasing uncertain world, it is about bringing stakeholders together early on, breaking up siloed thinking, build a comprehensive understanding from the get-go and an appreciation of the issues at stake, both in terms of risks and opportunities, and then ultimately provide an ecosystem where multiple solutions can flourish. So with this, I hope I gave you a flavor of the range of issues that are covered and worked on in the Ag2050 initiative. And I would like to hand over now to Katie for reflections about the enabling environment and how we can address current advances and challenges while maintaining a long-term outlook. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Frank. And I wish we could address how we will look at these issues. What we probably will do in the time that we have, only 1 hour for a webinar, is admire the problems, but it's something that we can at least do together. And of the very rich work that Frank has shown you there too. Sorry, I've just lost my presentation. I know you can see it, but I can't. There we go. There are 3 key themes that really stand out from the AFI's perspective, and they are innovation, land use, and trade. Now, there are many more that we could add to this list. Again, just for the purposes of this discussion today, we want to make sure that we focus in on things that the AFI and CSIRO together can see as really clear emerging priorities in where the enabling environment can help us get towards those positive scenarios, where it might be hindering us and leading us down more of a negative path. So let's quickly look first at innovation as a bridge. And now Frank has given you a very good overview of the articles and the work that's been undertaken in the Ag2050 program of work and what you can read in that publication. We'll give you the link at the end of this webinar as well. But innovation as a bridge is an increasingly interesting point of discussion, certainly in global circles. Innovation is not just about doing things differently. It does mean creating those solutions that are fit for a whole system, not just for a single purpose. Australian farmers are very much innovative by nature. We have to be, but purposeful innovation thrives particularly well when public and private sectors work together to strengthen the sustainability of our agri-food systems. And it's also very clear that no one country can innovate alone. That exchange of ideas and learnings is really necessary to accelerate innovation at the pace required to meet these current challenges. So to that end, in addition to the work that Frank's referred to as well, the AFI is a founding member of a group called GIFBI, the Global Forum on Farm Policy and Innovation. Now that's a collaboration of 4 farm-focused think tanks in Australia, in the US, the Farm Foundation, in Canada, the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, and in the EU, the Forum for the Future of Agriculture, for independent think tanks, which is really important. And GIFBI facilitates dialogue in ag policy development. Our latest paper from that group is called Finding Common Ground in a Divided World. And one of the things highlighted in that paper is the role of innovation in collectively addressing these challenges laid out in the Ag2050 scenarios. Now, looking at this messy map here, I don't expect you to read it all. Don't try to read it all. It just provides a bit of a snapshot of part of our innovation system in Australian agriculture. This is a snapshot that the AFI produced of the Australian R&D ecosystem for agricultural emissions reductions in mid-2024. So it's a tiny slice for a particular focus at a point in time, and yet you can see the different connections across there. For your information, those yellow sections on the slide, hopefully no one here is colorblind. Apologies if you are. The yellow sections are R&D programs. The green parts, which are mostly in the middle there, are those ecosystem segments such as cooperative research centres, private and public funding, academia, philanthropy. And the blue sections are specific organisations, and they range across public and private investment. And there's a whole lot of connection points. There are overlaps in this system. There are connections in this system. Sometimes there's duplication as well. This is just serving as an illustration of those different intersections, and noting that our public-private approach to agricultural innovation and research is the envy of many around the world. We can, of course, always do better. So in that paper I referred to, again, we'll provide links for all of these afterwards, CSIRO actually authored a particular section in there on enabling innovation, building off the Ag2050 work. And some of the highlights from that particular paper were that our approach, as Frank mentioned, our RDC system, the Research Development Corporation system, has strengths. It also has limitations. The RDCs are understandably oriented towards prioritising commercial needs of levy-paying farmers. They have a particular mandate focused on their commodity, but they're mistakenly sometimes viewed as the entire ag innovation system, which is not fair on the rest of us. It's also not fair on the RDCs. It overlooks a much broader set of players and capacities that could be marshalled around common innovation goals, and it unfairly holds the RDCs responsible for a lack of progress on some goals which are difficult for them to meet on their own. The RDC system wasn't designed to address these broader value chain and multi-sector productivity, sustainability, inclusion goals, it's often structurally constrained in its ability to do so. So some additional innovation systems capabilities that were noted in this paper are needed to complement this approach, and those include focusing on capacities needed to make productive use of ideas and technology, directing innovation towards different goals, and the ability to diffuse and share those ideas and just look at innovation differently rather than the traditional models we use. Those included highlights on mission mode investment, thinking about innovation rather than traditional research and report, scaling up where we can, and transferring learnings between contexts and sectors. Managing land use is a really big focus for the AFI, for the National Farmers Federation, for CSIRO, for anybody who's interested in agriculture in Australia. Now, Frank's already shown you this map and referred to the article in the AFI's journal. I also wanted to highlight, though, that land use has a major effect on our natural resources through impacts on soil, nutrients, waters, planet, animals, and there's a strong link between changing patterns of land use and the economic and social conditions in Australia, particularly in regional Australia. And if you think about livestock grazing using up almost half of that land use, and then you can see hopefully on that slide in a bit more detail there, where do we have cropping? That comes up in the green when I click that. So our cropping belt around the outside as well. And of course, a lot of these are mixed land uses that you can see on there. We actually don't have that much land to expand into. In fact, as Frank highlighted, and it's apparent in that article, we are losing agricultural land footprint. Whether or not that's a good or bad thing has to be assessed within certain strategic goals, which we just don't have set in agriculture at the moment. But we need to be clear that when people say, but ag can always go elsewhere and produce elsewhere, we just can't. There is a limit to the arability and the usefulness of that land. And we need to decide how we're going to use that land and for what purposes, and where we place food production and fibre production within our overarching economic goals. Overlaying this map on top of that previous one, this is a little bit old now, but I haven't had time to update it. Australia's combined drought indicator back in May 2025, which also gives you a very neat picture of our flood indicator in 2025, shows the current conditions, or the then current in May, across our productive regions, and that dark brown area, of course, being exceptional drought. Dark blue was exceptional flooding. So climate change is not an abstract concept for Australian farmers, and particularly if you think about certain industries or commodities like dairy, there's very real concern about the long-term viability of that industry, given the way that land use is changing, climate is impacting, and other uses of land are coming into play. The relationship between land use and agriculture is completely clear to all of us, but the changing dynamics of land, agriculture, and our transition to a net zero economy, they're really complex and they're evolving quite quickly. Governments and industry and farmers need to collectively consider actions to achieve the outcome of a strong, successful ag industry in 2050. And we need to know that we're taking a balanced land use approach to recognise the important role of ag production in delivering food security and bolstering economic resilience in regional communities, and be clearer about communicating that central and valuable role of food production alongside land-based carbon sequestration, renewable energy production, and the other things that we have very real and meaningful goals for. So it's important for the AFI and for CSIRO, as well as for many others, that we develop a very clear baseline of how these competing interests have changed our land use over time and what that future impact looks like. And that's the basis for ongoing collaboration between the AFI and CSIRO in the Ag2050 program of work. The final point that I'll end on before we open for some conversation too is the role of trade as a connector. So Australia's ag sector has never had the luxury of stability. Our producers operate at that intersection of climate extremes, volatile international markets, shifting global expectations about the environmental credibility of our food and fibre. But that exposure to deregulated markets, to demanding production conditions, and to global competition has shaped Australia into one of the world's most resilient and innovative ag exporters. This also gives Australia a distinct role in a world now grappling with food system uncertainty. Economic pressures, geopolitical tensions, contested sustainability goals and ideas, they are unsettling some long-held assumptions about what constitutes reliability in trading partners, and global value chains are increasingly seeking suppliers who can demonstrate transparent, measurable sustainability outcomes without compromising productivity or affordability. Across many of the AFI's recent interactions with stakeholders, policy leaders, international counterparts, private sector market participants, a really consistent theme has emerged that Australia's experience, as much as we can always do better, our experience offers a model for how to integrate sustainability, trade competitiveness, and innovation in a way that's grounded rather than ideological. So some of you in this group of people will have heard me talk about the AASF, or the Australian Ag Sustainability Framework, ad nauseum over the past 5 years. So rather than go through that, I wanted to highlight that, like the AASF, which was the first all of sector country-specific framework to look at sustainability principles, the APEC Sustainable Agri-Food Systems, to which Australia is a signatory, recognise there's no one-size-fits-all for agri-food systems policy, and these principles highlight that food security is inherently linked to stewardship of natural capital, thriving communities and profitable economies, that ag policies must reflect the unique circumstances of our different production systems, that regional cooperation should be grounded in a shared vision and agreed standards where possible, and that open and fair trade is a vital component of stable, functional agri-food systems. So this also leans into a lot of GIFBI's recent work. The APEC principles have been reinforced in our engagements with other stakeholders around the world. Again, these are difficult to read, but I'll provide the link to the paper. But global participants in workshops run by GIFBI over the past year and a half have brought some great insights across the table, and we have a lot more in common than we think with people who we often feel that we're very different to in trading systems. Some of the quotes highlighted in this particular paper resonate pretty strongly with this. There are goals in Australia, such as keeping markets open, encouraging innovation to enable sustainable growth, and avoiding unintended consequences, plus allowing for flexibility in regional approaches to agri-food system sustainability. Now, keeping an eye on the time as well, I can see that we're up to 1:45 in my part of the world, 11:45 in other parts, or anywhere you are around Australia. So if I stop there to go back to a conversation with Frank before we open to some questions, that's a lot of information that we've just thrown to all of you, I know. Frank and I have both highlighted a few key areas where we see some really interesting avenues for further pursuing under this Ag2050 banner of work. Frank, I mentioned land use there as being really critical to the AFI and to AFI stakeholders. So as an independent think tank, we have members from corporate agribusiness, from advocacy organisations, from government departments. We have a lot of different representation across our membership. But the consistent theme for all of those is land use change, and that's certainly where AFI would like to lean in. What else has come through as a priority that you've seen out of this piece of work?
Several things. So one of with this, work now moving along with Ag2050, of course, what the next steps are is diving further into these pathways and how we can create really the flexibility and adaptability that is required in this uncertain environment. That includes, for one, also to, as I said earlier, expanding the space for solution providers and the discussion space, and it involves strengthening and the opportunities and engagement and roles also for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. So there's the Caring for Country project is complementing the Ag2050 work. We need to think about the target space. A lot of these, there's several targets that have been vocalized and already agreed on, or at least outlined for agriculture, but these are very fragmented and they're pursued often in a siloed way. And in order to better capture these trade-offs, I think, as also applies more broadly with the food system, it's bringing that understanding of that target space together to allow for different assessments to look into the trade-offs that can be through dialogues, living labs. So we have a living labs team that looks at more downscaled approaches to these scenarios and discussions, and there will be lessons learned through Ag2050, but also at the national scale, allowing for assessments, integrated assessments through modeling and queries with experts and dialogues on what are the possible trade-offs if we want to hit multiple targets and not just pursue one or two. The other thing which is very dear to my heart, and obviously we're confronted with a lot of risks, and these risks they play out across different scales, they have different origins, and so on. And nobody has a complete picture. We all act on our perception of risk exposure, be it the farmers, the decision makers, and so on. Everybody has a particular lens. So I think it's very, very important to understand our collective perceptions of risk and speak openly about it and highlight where we see trade-offs and but also opportunities, risks of not acting versus acting and so on, so that we have an open dialogue. The Riskwise initiative does some of that, and I'm very keen on exploring that further on how we can better capture perceptions of risk across stakeholder groups, track these, and also validate what are the underlying facts for these perceptions.
I'm glad you brought up trade-offs too, because that's something that's really important, not only in the land use discussion, but also in this trade discussion too. Is what do we need to consider in terms of trade-off? There is always something that has to be compromised throughout the system for the greater good to be served. But Lily, I know that there's a few questions coming through, so we might throw back to you to see if we can take a few of those before we run out of time.
Absolutely. Thank you, Katie and Frank. And I have lots of questions myself, but that's too generous. And I won't do that. I'll pass it on to the group because we don't have a lot of time, but I do know that there's a couple of questions that I want to air. I'm going to pause recording first so that we can get into a chat sort of mode now. All right.